Life Audio.
Hello. Thank you for listening to Your Daily Bible Verse, the podcast that examines one verse each day to learn more about God and His will for our lives. I'm your host, Kyle Norman. After a brief message from one of our sponsors, we will continue with our series, Moses, From Fearful to Faithful. Today's verse can be found in Exodus, chapter 23, verse 12. 6 days do your work, but on the seventh day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and so that the slave born into your household and the foreigner living amongst you might be refreshed. Sabbath is countercultural and counterintuitive. It runs against every worldly inclination. When Moses received the Sabbath command, he didn't just receive an instruction about what he was to do versus what he was not to do. No, he was ushered into an alternative way of life, a way to think about his entire world and the life of the community that he led. We often refer to Sabbath as a day of rest, and it is. But have you ever asked yourself what this means? What exactly is the rest that we are invited into? Is it a momentary pause from our desk demands and task-oriented agendas? Is Sabbath simply a day off from work, thereby becoming a day to do what we want, when we want, at the pace we want? No, Moses wasn't told to adopt a day of leisure and personal delight. God's design for the Sabbath was so much more than that. If we return to the Ten Commandments, we see something unique about this commandment. Not only does the call to Sabbath lie in the middle of God's instructions, it's also the longest, and thereby the most detailed of the Ten Commandments. This would seem like an overemphasis if Sabbath keeping was just a day to take a nap or watch a movie. No, Moses is being invited into a radical new way of life, one that he was to extend to the community of the redeemed. Sabbath was an invitation to a deeper life with God. The rhythm of working 6 days and resting on the seventh, and working the land for 6 years and letting it lie fallow the seventh. It was to remind Israel that their vitality wasn't based on their prowess or their production. In Sabbath, the anxiety and fear felt over the toil of work was to be replaced by a radical disposition of trust. And so observing the Sabbath wasn't just about Israel resting. It was about them extending the divine rest to others so that all could learn to live in the restorative trust of the Lord. Sabbath-based living is completely at odds with an Egypt-based life, one centered on production and efficiency. Under the Egyptian Empire, Israel's value and their identity as a people was based on how many bricks they could churn out in a day. Israel was a labor force, and the harder they worked, the better they were. The observance of Sabbath, therefore, became this act of resistance against a false identity. Having been removed from slavery, no longer was Israel's identity drawn from the cycle of production and consumption. Instead, Israel was to claim their full identity as the redeemed of the Lord. And so the call to observe a Sabbath was a call for Israel to reclaim their identity as people created and people redeemed. When Israel rested on that seventh day from all their work and allowed the animals and the foreigners and the servants to rest as well, they were embedding themselves in an alternative way of life. They were reminding themselves that they were no longer slaves to the constant demands of production. No longer was their value a mere byproduct of how hard they could work. See, Sabbath has a restorative function. It recreates us. In calling Moses to enter Sabbath, the Lord was calling him to be recreated, not in the image of an enslaved people, nor in the image of Egyptian royalty, but in the image of the God who called him and set him apart. And with that new understanding of himself, his life, and the world in which he lived, Moses was to extend that invitation to the people of faith. When we cultivate a sense of Sabbath in our lives, we incarnate a distinct identity amidst a world that can too often be inhospitable to a life outside the cycle of consumerism. But we are not formed by what we consume. We are not created by what we produce. Who we are, at a fundamental level, are children of God, alive, loved, and free. We live as a different people, removed from the toilsome burden of be more, do more, or try harder. We are invited to stop, to relax, and enjoy the peace that comes from the presence of God within us. If we view Sabbath as just a day off, it becomes far too easy to fill the day up with various forms of toil and busyness. We manage our chores, we attend to personal needs, we maximize our day of delight, but by doing so, we inevitably end the day in exhaustion. Is that what it means to be recreated by the God of our liberation? Hardly. So what might it look like for you to truly observe a Sabbath? To let the call of busyness just lie follow? How might Sabbath unite you to the one who doesn't just call you to different tasks, but calls you to a radical new way of life? And how might you, like Moses, extend that peace and that rest to others?